In this episode, we look at that famous, lovable, roundheaded loser and his beloved beagle with a rich fantasy life. A duo that have captured hearts across generations. We dive into why these iconic characters aren't just comic strip staples, they're cultural touchstones. We're talking about the enduring legacy, emotional depth, and quiet brilliance of Charlie Brown and Snoopy. Here we go. And here we are. Thank you for tuning in to the greatest characters in pop culture history. Today's guest is a familiar face for those of you who've seen our other podcast, Paranormal Popcast. My co-host, Vinny Forgione. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me on your greatest characters of all time.
This is awesome. This
podcast.
Is great. Yeah, I'm so used to talking about paranormal stuff with you. I don't think Charlie Brown and Snoopy would qualify as paranormal. But no, that's the topic for today. So what makes you think that they're the greatest of all time?
I think with both those characters, and I mean, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to how Charles Schulz created them. But, I mean, I sort of categorized it in the ideas of they're authentic. Okay, like that's one theme that I find going through here is that I think they're authentic, and because they come through Charles Schulz's voice directly.
That's a great point.
That's what he was doing. When you look at really any comic strip or most comic strips, and this isn't a criticism of them, it's just to show what Charles Schulz did that nobody else does. A lot of comic strips are really just, here's a joke. Right? You don't really know, or you don't really have insight into the creator. With Charlie Brown and Snoopy, you have insight into the creator because he's talking about anxieties, he's talking about all kinds of things, which we'll probably get into a little bit more. But that's why you relate to it. And he was a type of person, he wasn't eccentric, he was mild-mannered. He was in his own words, an ordinary person. And he just funneled that through all the characters, but Charlie Brown and Snoopy, of course, were really representative of the whole scope of, I guess, a human being. You know what I mean? Charlie Brown is the everyman, and I think Snoopy just sort of represents like whimsy, like just like everything else, or maybe things we imagine ourselves to be. But they really encompass, I think, the authenticity that Charles Schulz fed into both those characters.
And I find it interesting that you picked, and I thought the same thing. They go hand in hand, Charlie Brown and Snoopy. It's not like, hey, let's do an episode about Charlie Brown. Hey, let's do an episode about Snoopy. I think they are together. Like, he's Charlie Brown's dog, even though he doesn't really acknowledge it sometimes that much. And Charlie Brown, even though he interacts with other characters, Linus and Lucy and his sister Sally and Schroeder, Snoopy is like his connection. Like,
right.
And they've done stories about that too, like when Snoopy's gone away and like the loss and everything. But what do you think about their bond together and they're kind of going hand in hand?
I think that in terms of Snoopy, and this is kind of funny because when I grew up, and I've been into Peanuts since as long as I could read, right? So I've always been a fan. And I didn't have dogs growing up. But when I got married, we got dogs. And I realized that Snoopy is very realistic as a dog. There's a whole, like, you think of Snoopy as just like, this crazy character that you could do anything with because he's not human. But, like, dogs have both this completely perplexed sometimes, right? They're not like cats where walk around like, They don't care about anything. The dogs get like very confused, and that's part of Snoopy. But there's also this supreme confidence in dogs. Like they just, do their own thing, and they, build like little houses in their, in the house, like pull stuff and put them into like a corner, and that's like the dog house. So I think there is a connection in terms of like really the human and the dog. So that's one of the connections. Like they're both realistic as like in every dog and in every man.
That's a good point.
That's how I kind of see them in that light. I think too because they represent so much in the comic strip. It's the bond is loyalty, and you mentioned it, and I had been thinking about this. Like Charlie Brown is portrayed as like the loser, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the sort of everyone's like criticizing him. He's like, I can't get this or that, but he's the guy who has all the friends, and so Snoopy. Like, in some sense, I think the bond is that they're very much like each other. Mm-hmm. They're dependent upon each other, and they have I guess, two sides of the same coin, right? Like, Charlie Brown you couldn't say, like, oh, Charlie Brown is this, but you could say that about Linus, right? You could say that about Lucy. Lucy's crabby. Linus is, like, intellectual or something like that. Peppermint Patty's a sporto, right? Like they had like these very narrow things, but neither Snoopy nor Charlie Brown are easily defined, and that's why they're the stars of the show, mm-hmm. right? And that's I think that's their bond, is that essentially they're two sides of the same coin,
right? And I think. You mentioned a good point there, because it's like when I had my episode about Mr. Spock, we talked about the trio of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and how each one kind of represented an aspect of the human personality, and together they were kind of greater than individually.
Right.
And I think the same thing with Charlie Brown and Snoopy. You mentioned, the loser aspect, but more like the lovable loser. Like there's this point about, Charles Schultz didn't make Charlie Brown to just be a loser where bad things happen to him all the time and he's depressed all the time. There is that optimism associated with him as well.
Right.
And this Snoopy, he's like this super confident, he can do everything. Right?
Yeah.
All these fantasy characters that he has, he is so like unbeatable. And I think together, they kind of flesh out and make the story what it is. But I guess let's talk about just the history. Like Charles Schultz made these characters in the 1940s, right? He had a prior comic strip called Little Folks, mm-hmm. And from the beginning, Charlie Brown was the character, right? There's that great strip of whether it was the first Peanuts comic strip or the first Little Folks, where Charlie Brown is just walking by. He's got this big grin on his face, very simply drawn, like big head, right? Just walking through. And you got these two girls sitting on the curb, and they're like, there's Charlie Brown. Good old Charlie Brown. And then the last panel, the joke, the punchline, how I hate him. It's like, right. So you see this kind of, poor kid, what did he do? He's just walking by smiling. Why do people hate him? So he is this kind of abused character. Bad things happen. Lucy always swipes that football away, won't let him kick it. You blockhead, they call him all these poor names, right? And he just has bad luck. Every time he flies a kite, it gets eaten up by the tree, and but he always seems to be optimistic. You said people like him. He's manager of his, Little League baseball team, right? He's the pitcher. So it's like,
I think because you hit on something there too, because and famously, Charles Schultz hated the name of the comic strip, Peanuts, which I actually think is a great name for the comic strip, because it's like a trademark. When you hear Peanuts, you know what you're talking about, and it's about the whole gang, even though Snoopy and Charlie Brown are the stars. But he had, and you also mentioned that, you think of Snoopy. Sometimes you might have been like when we read them in the comic strip. Oh, I read Snoopy today. You refer to it as Snoopy, or you refer to it as Charlie Brown. A lot of times we didn't refer to it as Peanuts. But one of the, and he had added this to a lot of times where, especially I think the Sunday comics, it would say that. It would say Peanuts featuring good old Charlie Brown, right? And that was the name he wanted to call it eventually, was good old Charlie Brown. And they were like, yeah, no, what choice did he have? But that goes to what you're saying. He's just good old Charlie Brown, like you do like him. And I think one of the reasons that when you talked about that he never gave up, he always persevered, those kinds of things. And those are, I think, some life lessons and things about humanity that are in the character. But he was trusting. That's a quality I think that Charlie Brown had, was that he always trusted in the good of people. And he was the guy with the friends. Mm-hmm. And he was the guy who always, like you said, was optimistic. I'm gonna try to kick that football again, because she wouldn't do that to me.
He would never give up.
She's not going to do that to me 4 times. She won't. The 10th time, he was always looking at the good. And some of those characters were the opposite. Not that they were, bad people, but it was like sort of these traits of, like, you shouldn't really be this way. You should be more like Charlie Brown. Like, Lucy was crabby and a bit of a bully, right? She bullied her brother Linus. Sally had like that, I guess, I want to call it maybe narcissistic, maybe like greedy. You think about the Christmas special where she's like, ask Santa Claus for 10s and 20s to make it, easy. Like, it was also like, I guess they maybe represented more the vices. And Charlie Brown really didn't have vices. And that's why he's like good old Charlie Brown, because he's just good. And yeah, I think that's what makes that character likable, even though he's sort of the loser.
Yeah. And again, to epitomize that lovable loser dichotomy, like his catchphrase, good grief, right? You see the paradox in that too. It's
right,
good,
that's right,
and yet it's grief, right?
Yeah.
So he's both optimism and pessimism, right?
Yeah.
So he started Sparky, that's his nickname, Charles Schultz, right? A lot of people. So in the first Little Folks, he actually would sign it Sparky as the pen name, and he originally was just in like one newspaper in Minneapolis, right? The Minneapolis Tribune or something. I think he was maybe inspired a little bit by the Little Rascals or that kind of R gang, because the whole premise is the social life of kids. You don't see adults, rarely, like every once in a while, they'll mention like the teacher or the parent, and then when they started adapting them for the cartoons, you had that gibberish sound of their voices, and you would just see their legs or their feet. So what do you think about that? Like, just kind of looking at it from the perspective of just the kids and their life. And obviously they talk a little bit more like adults, right? They're talking about philosophical issues and stuff. And it's kind of funny, like, so I always kind of am reminded a little bit about the Little Rascals, but I haven't seen anywhere where there's been any direct attribution that maybe he was inspired by, like, Spanky and Alfalfa and Darla and all these other characters. What do you think about that?
I think it's very possible. I thought about that before we came on and doing this. One of the things that, whether it was very intentional, although I think he probably did have this in mind, is going back to what I said about authenticity. Children are authentic. I mean, that's probably the attraction of the Little Rascals too, right? But any adult in that comic would have disrupted the authenticity of the children. And I think he chose children because children are innocent, and children just, again, are their authentic selves. And whether it was just by instinct or like I said, intentional, I think that's the real reason why you don't see adults, because it would just disrupt their characters and who they were. It's also, a pretty powerful message sometimes about, like, adults as teachers, I guess. But, I don't think he was going that deep into it. But he did say, and because I have some, like I have this.
Oh, nice. Golden
it's
celebration.
That's the 50th
Yeah,
anniversary.
Vinny's holding up a book, gold covered, and Peanuts, a golden celebration.
I think a lot of
50-year
was,
anniversary, I guess.
Yeah, and a lot of it was him. And let me see if I can find it. There's this thing at the beginning of Peanuts, and it says here, the neighborhood in which the characters live ceased gradually to be real. It was more realistic at the beginning, right?
Okay.
And so they became less real. Snoopy's doghouse could function only if it were drawn from direct side view. Snoopy himself had become a character so unlike a dog that he could no longer inhabit a real doghouse. And the cartooning of the other characters with their large round heads and tiny arms came frequently to prohibit them from doing some of the more realistic things that a normal style of cartooning would allow. Nevertheless, this was the direction I wanted to take, and I believe it has led me to do some things that no one ever before attempted in a comic strip. That's from Charles Schulz himself in development, and I think that, to another extent, answers the question. He was looking to portray, and I think we talk about Charlie Brown and Snoopy as we're talking right now, that they're realistic, and that sort of stuck out to me where he said, no, they're not realistic, and that's the point. He was able to do what he wanted to do with those characters as characters by not drawing it realistically. And I think, again, you take the adults out of the picture because then you have to do some sort of realism. And in a sense, these are, they're an amalgam of adults and children, right? So it's not realistic, but it's brilliant.
Yeah, and it's so simplistic in the drawing style. Like,
yes.
I looked at some of the stuff that Charles Schulz has done. He was an artist. He could do like realism. He could do things like that if he wanted to. And when he chose to do, and that was the trend with these comic strips at the time. It was very simplistic drawings and renderings. But you're right about the doghouse just being portrayed from one angle and one side. But how much he could do with those simple drawings, and he was the only one that ever drew a Peanuts comic strip. He didn't have any assistants. Nobody else did the lettering. Nobody else did the coloring. He did it right up until the end. And you could see towards the end of his life, those last few strips, the shaky lines, like you could tell his hand was shaking as he was drawing it. But I remember him saying, I don't think anybody wants anyone else to draw it but me. It's coming from me. And his family was the same. After he passed, they're like, nobody else is ever going to draw another comic strip of Charlie Brown and Snoopy. But, he let other people adapt it and, turn it into cartoons and movies. And, but what do you think about just it being associated so much to him? Because there's been other strips where once the originator passes, somebody else will draw it and you don't associate the name of the creator with those characters. Like, can you tell me who invented, Marmaduke, and who invented, some of these, Andy Cap and some of these other, I can't.
Right.
Unfortunately.
That's right, because you'd have to be Charles Schulz to draw Peanuts. And of course, Peanuts is, the drawing is separate from the content of what he was writing. But I like, especially as a kid, but even now, like, if you try to draw like Snoopy, just like, there's like these little angles and stuff that you could never, like, recreate what he did, like, so easily. And you see, like, over time too, and especially when you look at those last comic strips in the 90s, they're very big. Like, he couldn't draw in detail like he used to, and you notice that progression. But like, then you watch him age. Like, you could look at the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and you could tell if it's in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s just because you were watching Charles Schulz, adapt and change. as far as the artwork goes, I think one, the simplicity of it, especially Charlie Brown, like he's bald. Like what kid is bald, right? Like
He
in
does have
the
that
sense
little
that, like,
strand, right in his
it's a little
forehead.
strand ahead. But he's the star of the show, and you have this big palette for his expressions, right? Snoopy is black and white, right? He has one little spot on his back, and black ears. But other than that, nothing distinguishing, and it's all expression. It's a bigger palette to draw with. The other characters are actually a more complex drawing. Lucy is, Linus is. Charlie Brown has the iconic shirt. He's the star. Like there's so much detail. Again, is it genius instinct, intentional? Probably, a combination of both. But one of the other things that I've noticed about the Peanuts comic strip that's different from anyone else or most other people is when you look at any of his strips, they're like a storyboard. They're cinematic. You have an establishing shot, you have a close-up, you have an action of them walking, and then like the last thing is a punchline or something. But I'll look at things now. I'll say like, am I like noticing that right? And I look at other Wizard of It or like even For Better or For Worse or whatever. Like a lot of them are just like two people there standing, right, and they're talking, and the next panel is the same thing, and the next panel is the same thing. Mm-hmm. But what he drew in his art was a storyboard. And that's probably, or I would say probably, I don't know. But I think that's why he also translated so well to film.
Yeah.
Because it was always cinematic. Mm-hmm. Again, you can see from it, like I'm just completely and have always been in awe of like this comic strip.
Yeah, and it fit the format of at the time. It's a shame there aren't as popular comic strips now, I guess because the newspaper medium isn't as broad as it used to be. But that whole gag strip medium, right, these humor comics, like 4 panels, like you said, it was like this formula of you would tell a joke every day, just tell a joke, right? And he used that, right? Versus like some of these single panel ones. You had like Family Circle and then Far Side, which was like one panel joke, like a one gag. But you had to tell a story in those 4 panels, right? And he was really good at that. And we talked about how simplistic it was, but he really needed that artistic skill to tell the story. Like how many times can he take Snoopy and just turn it into a vulture or something else, and it's just so simple, and even Charlie Brown. I remember back in the 90s you sent me a comic strip. I don't know if you remember which one it was. We were both working and you sent me, he was one of the baseball strips, and it showed Charlie Brown in the dugout, and it was a play on Joe Torre back then, the manager of the Yankees, and he was just sitting there, and just the way he drew him, you could tell it's Charlie Brown. But as a baseball fan, I was like, holy cow, he captured the epitome of Joe Torre, and it was a great gag. So he would sometimes take things from pop culture and what was happening in the real world and kind of play it up. So like you said, if you saw a strip, if it was the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. Like he would take things that people were talking about and just really play it up through the eyes of these kids and this dog.
Well, that's like Joe Cool,
Joe
right?
Cool,
that
right?
was said. What's the no wheels, man? It's like, why are you hanging out at no wheels, man? That's like the drag racing thing. You're right. You're exactly right. Like you can follow it through and see what was happening, and he was tuned into all that stuff. The one you were remembering is, this is my Joe Torre face. I'm going to sit here and scowl, and I'll win every game.
I'm not gonna do anything, just scowl, and we're gonna win.
And what you said, like you can see, like he was a big sports fan, Charles Schultz, and he's sitting there watching the World Series or something, and is like, Joe Torre just sits there and scowls,
And they're winning.
Like, you know, they won, you know, 4 World Series. I mean, he passed away before they won the 4 World Series, but yeah, that was the thing. Like, they were a dynasty, and he just sits there and scowls in the dugout. You don't even hear him talk, you know, see him talk. But yeah, those strips are him really, you know, hitting on the culture at the time too, and he had a knack for doing that, like very like keen observation of the culture. And again, when you don't have like super realistic drawings and characters, then you have you have the ability to be timeless.
Yeah.
And
he
they are
is timeless.
You know, that all those characters are timeless. You could still do them now if if someone were able to.
Exactly. I thought once he passed away, that would be the end, really, since nobody else was drawing him. But
yeah,
it's still around, and we'll get to that. So when he started, like I said, he did Little Folks, and he tried to get it syndicated, but he was feeling like pigeonholed because the Minneapolis Tribune was just putting it, not even with the other comic strips, it was like in the women's section, kind of lifestyle, I guess because he was doing it about kids, and he's like, no, they don't see the concept. So then he tried to shop it around, and they finally bought it. I think it was United Feature Syndicate, right? And that's how that was the business. You had a syndication company that would just send it out to all these newspapers around the country, and you would get money that way through syndication. They wanted him to change the name because I guess there were a couple of other comic strips. There was Little Abner, Little Folks, which I don't remember Little Folks. I remember Little Abner. So he was like, okay, and like you said, he wanted it to be called Charlie Brown, and they were like, no, it's too simplistic, it's like, and he was like, well, what about Nancy? What about all these other? But they were like, no Charlie Brown. So he said Peanuts. So he was inspired by Howdy Doody. They had the Peanuts gallery there, and now it's like you said, synonymous with that, but you could still see how he hated it because all the cartoon adaptations, everything, none of them are called Peanuts. The most recent one, the Peanuts movie, had Peanuts, but now he's gone, so he couldn't say anything. But I imagine he was probably like, no, don't, just call it something with Charlie Brown. And every title was something about, Charlie Brown or Snoopy.
Charlie Brown, Thanksgiving, Charlie Brown. And I guess not only he didn't ever refer to it, even when the whole group, it was the Peanuts gang. Yeah. I mean, that's maybe stretching like how much influence he had on pulling the name back. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it wasn't often referred to as Peanuts in general, just that thing. It was, and it certainly wasn't in any of the television shows or movies when he was alive. Yeah. And then we go into the 60s, and suddenly CBS starts doing all these adaptations, the cartoons, and that brings it to a whole new life, right? Right.
So do you remember which cartoons really stand out? I mean, there was the Christmas. There were all the holiday ones, right? Thanksgiving and Halloween, right? The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. That was a great one. And any favorites of yours out of any of those specials? I think there were moments of each that are our favorites. But yeah, of course, the three of the specials are Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the Great Pumpkin. Christmas was just, Christmas. It was just like it was on that night. You had to behave because if you got punished and you couldn't watch it, you had to wait a whole other year. So, exactly.
So that was what that was like. We loved Christmas, the Christmas specials. I think Thanksgiving and Great Pumpkin, because they were done later, the first one, the Christmas one, is a little bit rougher.
That was the first one that they did in 1965.
They really didn't. They said they didn't know how to animate like the characters the way they drew them, because their arms were too short, their heads were too big, you know. So in that sense, there was, I guess, my favorites would be Thanksgiving. I remember as a kid, everybody loved that battle with the lawn chair.
Yes.
You know, and and
that was the
Snoopy,
one where they were eating like jelly beans and stuff for
and,
the
like,
Thanksgiving
any kid
dinner.
loves that, you know, like eating the Thanksgiving dinner with you know, popcorn, and what blockhead cooked all this. And again, like, the kids are like, everyone else is kind of like nasty, right? You know, the vices, right? Whatever it is. And poor Charlie Brown just like tried to like help his friends out, you know. And Snoopy the dog, like, again, the confidence of like, oh, you know, I'll cook dinner. Thanksgiving dinner. And you know, so that's probably my favorite. Great Pumpkin, that's with Charlie Brown too. There's sometimes like these just like iconic phrases and stuff, and that one is "I got a rock." Like,
Yeah,
you know, if
they're
that
trick or
doesn't-
treating, everybody's getting stuff, and they give poor Charlie Brown just a rock.
if that doesn't encompass who Charlie Brown is, 4 words, right? I got a rock, right? It's like a huge mess, you know. It's like an all-encompassing thing of how people feel, right? You know, like, everyone is getting something, and, you know, I got a rock, and you can still say it now. I just read it somewhere where, like, you know, we got a rock, and I was like laughing, but again, so Great Pumpkin was fun. Great Pumpkin, again, that's Linus, you know, trusting into putting all his eggs in that basket, you know, just like faith and trust and all that stuff, and doesn't work out, and he's like, I'll be back here next year.
That's
I'll
it.
find the sincerest pumpkin patch you're gonna
They
find.
don't give up. They don't give up. You know?
Yeah.
And that was, you know, the Halloween one. The focus was a lot on Linus and his belief with, you know. So you see those relationships that Charlie Brown has. You know, his best friend, I guess, was Schroeder for a while, but he got kind of sideswept by Linus. Linus became, you know, his big sidekick. You know, Linus with the security blanket, and there's those moments where they're just leaning on a wall and having these philosophical talks about things, you know, in the world, and it's really great, the interplay with all of them. You know, with Lucy, she's like you said, Abby, always angry, calling him a blockhead. But there is that affection still. Like, you know, they you know, that first special, they picked Charlie Brown to be the director of the Christmas pageant. And he's the manager of their Little League team. And he's,
Right.
you know, they trust him. They go to him.
Yeah.
And yet they yell at him. They're like, what a terrible tree, Charlie Brown. You couldn't pick a better tree. And then, of course, you know, they decorate it, and suddenly it becomes this beautiful tree, you know. So those aspects, they're just great little moral stories, you know. And you can't not root for Charlie Brown. You're always rooting for him, and he will never give up. Valentine's Day, he will constantly go to that mailbox looking for that Valentine. Nothing, still nothing, you know. But he won't give up. He'll go the next morning just in case, you know.
And then Snoopy walks away with a pile of letters. But that's also, you know, again, like, that's also, you ever, like, if you have a dog, like, everyone comes in and loves the dog, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, everybody, you're like, what about me? You know what I mean? Like, everyone, like, comes in is like, oh, hi, you know, you're so cute and everything. And, you know, the human beings are there like, yeah, whatever, hi.
So, good, you know, I guess we have to start talking about the red-haired girl that he is infatuated with, right? He never showed, Charles Schultz never showed her in the comic strip, from what I can tell. He was inspired by like a real person in his life, a lot of autobiographical stuff in his strips. then when you started doing the Valentine episodes, right? Because they did they did an Arbor
Yeah.
Day special. They
Yeah,
did like you think of any kind of holiday, and they did one. So the Valentine stuff, he had this crush on this red-haired girl, and the different versions of it, she looks slightly different.
yeah.
But what do you think about all that? I don't think it was ever reciprocated until I think there's a point where she kisses him on the cheek, or she. The last Peanuts movie, right? That was a central theme, right? Trying to get him, But this was after he was, Charles Schultz passed away. But what do you think of that whole storyline? With the, I guess we make it bigger than it is because she really didn't play that big of a role in the comic strip for a very long time. I think we just kind of like amplify it because it's just such a great story,
It was, I think in the comic strip, it was a bit, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
It was something he could go back to for Valentine's Day or whatever. And again, it follows a theme of unrequited love.
And
right?
she moves
that's
away, I think, at some point in the strip, and then
Right.
comes back, He
That's
sees her at camp, across the distance, like, oh my gosh, she's there,
Yeah, it's the unrequited love, which of course is a theme through the strip, but by not showing her, it represents like I guess I'm not even sure like what word I'm looking for, but like how much bigger it is in your mind than this is just another person, right? She's a little redhead girl. She's another human being, but like when you get like this, like I'm in love with this person. I want to meet. Like
He hasn't said a word to her yet.
Right. It becomes so much bigger than that in your mind. So that I think is what the effect is of not showing her, because we're actually seeing her through Charlie Brown's eyes and not how she really is. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a powerful message too about, seeing people for who they really are rather than just, she has beautiful red hair, like, and just this need, your own need to be loved, right? That's so yeah, I think that whole, even as small as it was in the overall scope of the comic strip, it was a very powerful message in it.
Yeah, and I think they eventually gave her a name, Heather, which I think was inspired by the real person that inspired the character. Mm-hmm. So that was a name that Charles Schultz gave to her. But everybody still calls her the little red-haired girl, So,
yes.
That's great. And so a lot of other characters. Schroeder with the piano, right?
Right.
And if you follow the strip, there is this whole subtext and backstory about, Charlie Brown, I think, gave Schroeder the piano or something, and there's like really.
Oh, that's right. I think.
Yeah,
one of the early strips that was like here. I think you're right. Yeah.
So it's like all this interesting. There's more than just, like you said, a gag a week.
Yeah.
He's telling a story, and I remember getting those compilation books. They would compile all these books and sell them, and he made $1 billion from all the merchandising and all the the licensing and everything. So as reading them in a book form, you see the story week after week. Like if you're just reading it in the newspaper, you might remember, oh yeah, that's a continuation of a gag from yesterday. But seeing in the book, like he would tell these like long stories that would last sometimes weeks, and just build on all this stuff. And it was great storytelling. Somebody said that he is he's told the longest story by a single person, like in history. So I don't know if that applies to other media, but certainly in the comic book form, since so many other these comic book properties are done by multiple creators, I think that is a record that he probably still holds and probably won't be beaten. Just great storytelling, and a lot of them were adapted into those cartoons early on. And then he did the movies. Have you seen the early movies? Like it was like the one where they're whitewater rafting and Snoopy Come Home and all those. I just remember those fondly when I was a kid. But they didn't do too many of them. The TV specials were the ones that were like, a lot, hundreds maybe. I don't know how many there were. But the movies were like a handful. But they really told a great story and characterized it really well.
Yeah, there was okay, I think the big three, and I forgot I always thought Snoopy Come Home was first, but it might not be.
I think it was The Boy Named Charlie Brown
Right.
was the movie.
Right. A Boy Named Charlie Brown was the first one. That was the spelling bee. Then,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Then Snoopy Come Home. Then Race
Which was a deep story. I mean,
Well,
you find out that Snoopy gets this letter from this girl, and he goes on this cross-country journey to her, and they're like, "What's going on?" And it turns out she's in a hospital, and it was the girl who gave away Snoopy as a puppy. What a deep story that was.
Well, that was. I think I want to put here. Did I? I know I wrote something about it. I just don't want to
And
miss it. But I guess
yeah.
yeah. Here it's like, and me and my brother, like, we'll talk about like this movie is just like to think that, and I remember seeing it in the movies, like when Snoopy Come Home, and it's like for little kids, and it's an emotional roller coaster.
Oh my gosh.
You know,
You think the girl's gonna die, right? She's like, oh.
You know, my mom said, like, all the kids came out, like, all choked up, like, after the movie was over, you know? I mean, it's so powerful, but,
Yeah,
like, this is what I said. Snoopy Come Home is an emotional roller coaster. The whole movie is an ethical dilemma told by a dog. And that it's like this huge ethical dilemma about faith and loyalty, and who are you loyal to, because this is a girl who's in the hospital and might be dying, and she needs his help, and it's his first owner, and Charlie Brown has no idea that there was another owner, but he's taking care of him his whole life. And that's like, adoption. That's like about adoption too. You know what I mean? Who are you loyal to if you find your first, biological parent? Like,
and the one who gave you away and all this
exactly.
stuff.
Like, and there was just. You're right. I mean, it's like so deep, but it's like all this like hard, like ethical questions, like told by a dog. You know.
And that's what's amazing. It's like it goes into the psychological stuff. Lucy has her little, people sell lemonade at stands. She's selling psychological advice for 5 cents, and that's been played to death. That's a trope that's been used a bunch of times, and he invented it. It's like, it's just amazing.
Well, that you bring up the tropes. I mean, there are things that people even don't realize that he invented, like the security blanket. Like, there's no such thing. That wasn't a term that he co-opted from, something else. That there was, this thing called like a trope or something that you called a security blanket. No, Linus carried around this blanket, and they called it a security blanket, and that's where that came from. Even the term happiness is, I think, came from a peanut strip.
Yeah, he had a
Happy is a warm puppy, but I mean, obviously, people. That's like a word that people would use, but as a pop culture trope, it came from Peanuts.
Yeah, and that became very popular. Happiness is a Warm Puppy. That was one of his best-selling books.
Yeah.
So he's he was just very more than just telling a gag. Like, he was doing social commentary. Like, just when he created Franklin, right?
Yeah.
The African American character, that got backlash from the South. Some of these places that were syndicating his strip, they were like, "Oh, please don't have him go to the same class, the same school." And he was like, "No, you're gonna run my comic the way I wrote it." So he really stood up.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really powerful too. Like, it's like he was using his strip. He could have very much just cashed the checks and done a gag a day, and But I think the reason it became such a pop culture phenomenon was because there was more depth to it. Because he was making some social commentary about kids and about life and about adults through the eyes of kids. I think that was really important. So they adapted it for the stage. You had musicals. So have you ever seen a stage adaptation?
I have never seen that.
Okay.
I think my brother was in it as a junior high school kid. They had like some like drama or meet thing. And I saw that, but it's like a kid's production or whatever, so I don't have but much of a recollection. But yeah, I never did see like the stage adaptations of Charlie Brown.
My son just did an adaptation of Charlie Brown Christmas. He played Linus, and he was so great. And that's the kind of thing where it's like they turned that into a musical for the stage, and the music, right? I think that first special.
Yeah.
I think we have to give credit, and I'm blanking on the name of the composer, but
Henry Mancini.
yes,
Yeah.
And did that
No,
music is also
no, I'm thinking that's a different
Sorry.
wrong guy. Vince Guaraldi.
There you go.
I should know the name Vince. Like,
You
shame
should.
on me.
But that music is so associated with Charlie Brown too, and it became so popular, and it was just so catchy. And you were saying how difficult it was maybe to animate, but I'm picturing them dancing,
Yeah.
in that first scene, and it's just the music is so infectious. And so then I think they adapted the stage production. So it's this loop. Right, so you have people who took the comic strip, turned them into cartoons, and then people were inspired to turn them into stage adaptations and into musicals. And then CBS took those musicals and licensed them and adapted them. So there are actual TV specials of the musicals, which I haven't seen. I have to look them up.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But there were there's one on Snoopy, and then there's the Charlie Brown, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And those are the only ones I think where you see Snoopy talking. Like, that's an interesting thing.
Oh,
we
right,
haven't talked much
right.
about Snoopy yet. We've been focusing more on Charlie Brown, but you see the thought bubbles, right? So
Yeah.
he talks, but he never speaks out loud. And in most of the cartoons, he never talks. He just does this kind of like sound effects, but in the musical, like, I think there's a point where he sings and stuff. So it's very, very interesting. I want to look those up. But any thoughts about that? Like how, let's talk about Snoopy's fantasy life. I guess he's the flying ace where he's fighting the Red Baron. He's a world famous author, like on top of his his doghouse, typing away on his manual typewriter. He's French Foreign Legion. He's Joe Cool. You mentioned Joe Cool. Right, and just those iconic moments of just him just sleeping on top of which dog sleeps on top of the doghouse instead of those visuals that are just so iconic.
Yeah, well, that was what I think part of what I had read out of that book was that he said when Snoopy became less realistic, you couldn't draw a realistic doghouse. You had to draw it from the side because he was too unrealistic. I remember now. I could have this wrong, but I think that the artist who drew Kathy, and if this is true, because she would have had to been drawing Kathy in either the 60s or the 70s when this first happened, but I think she said when he first put, or someone said this, when he first put Snoopy on the doghouse as the World War I flying ace, the artists knew that he was in a different league. Like that was like we're not anywhere near where he is.
The creativity.
The creativity.
You never know what can happen.
And again, what does all this stuff represent? I think it represents fantasy. Everyone has their fantasies of who they wish they were, who they wish they wanted to be. But I have to bring up like this, just like how how funny the strip is. One of my favorite strips where Snoopy like is mixing up his like fantasies because something happened in like a story where he must have had to take Sally somewhere in his Sopwith camel, right? And like he took her and he like did something or whatever, and then he was dressed in the Foreign Legion, and there was some sort of like dispute about something, and Sally's like, you took me there, you took me in your airplane, and they're standing next to the doghouse, and Snoopy's got his Foreign Legion hat on, and he goes, airplane? I thought this was Fort Zinderneuf. And it's one of those things. It's funnier if you read it than when I tell it. But it's just like that mix of then he's mixing up his fantasies, and so it's not only again, you can't just be like, oh, these so many powerful messages. It wasn't only funny; it's like hilarious. Like the comic strip is hilarious.
Yeah.
And it's just hard to imagine that one person could have done that for over 50 years.
Yeah. And he's done so many side stories that didn't catch on. Like the characters that he would write in the beginning, he stopped doing them because he didn't think they were interesting anymore. Then the ones that were like little throwaway characters suddenly got more prominence. Peppermint Patty and Marcy.
Right.
And he had like a whole family for Snoopy, like all these other different kind of characters. There was like the fat Snoopy, and then but the only one that really stuck was Spike, who was this, which ironically was named after Charles Schultz's actual first dog, I believe. And he's the one that's in the desert. So he's just a very interesting character. Yeah. And then as we wrap it up, I guess we look at how it's just entered the mainstream. Like he just licensed them out for commercials. Like MetLife has been for decades, and all these other, things. You see them in fast food and other. He did international commercials, so he made a fortune licensing them into like bed sheets and lunch boxes.
Yeah.
And how many? I mean, I've seen so many backpacks still with kids with Snoopy and Charlie Brown and comic books. People. There was an adaptation. I don't know if you read it, that showed them in the apocalypse, right? And it was obviously not licensed. No, it was an adaptation. It was an adult version. Yeah. You had a grown-up person, but you knew it was Charlie Brown because he was bald-headed and he had the shirt and he had a dog. Didn't look like a beagle to me, but it looked like Snoopy. So they've done a lot of like fair use parodies and adaptations. But NASA really incorporated them, right? So you saw the design of their little caps look very much like Snoopy ears. So people joked about that. But then they named their lunar module and their command module after Snoopy and Charlie Brown, and they still have reference to them, right? They give the Silver Snoopy Award. And then the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. How many balloons over the years have been. You've had Snoopy in various forms, sleeping on his doghouse, or just by himself, or in his various characterizations. Right? Video games, commemorative stamps. It's just so much. And then the one story that really made me just realize there's this whole museum in Santa Rosa, California. Named after Charles Schultz Museum, and every so often they'll do Redheads Are Free Day, so a play on the little red-haired girl, and I just think that's adorable, and I think that's so cute, and I think and
Charles Schultz had the real crush. It's almost like he'll let the little the redheads in because like he has a
how cool is that Is there any pop culture reference or stuff that really stands out, or anything that you've seen that just shows the scope of the popularity of these characters?
I think it's just still they're everywhere, and you can dress Snoopy up in any costume. I think it's funny with the moon landing. And I think it just shows the power of Snoopy even then, because I'm pretty sure that where the association came from was, again, one of Snoopy's fantasies. This thing happened, right? And Charles Schultz was always in tune of, what was happening in culture. And it's just, at the end of the strip, he's like it's like the beagle has landed. And what's more iconic than that? Because the eagle has landed is, of course, iconic. And so the beagle has landed, and everyone saw that, and it must have just, captured people's imaginations. But you're right. Then, they took it from there. But it was a perfect, integration with each other to market both the comic strip and awareness or whatever of the space program, like as a mascot. I'm trying to think if there was anything that stands out to me just I think that they're forever associated with baseball,
Yeah, for sure.
right? You know what I mean? Snoopy catching pop flies in his dog dish, and Charlie Brown. Well, this again, like it's just so funny that like you'll watch any baseball game and just see a pitcher get smacked around, and the notion that Charlie Brown's clothes come flying off. Again, it's like such a perfect image, and it's hilarious.
Yeah.
But like that's probably how pitchers feel sometimes
Very
when
true.
they're getting smacked around. But yeah, I think it will forever be associated with baseball, and I don't see that the images of these characters ever really go away.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are there
because
any
they represent
characters?
certain things. They do represent human emotion.
Yeah. Are there any characters, side characters that we didn't mention? We didn't really talk about Pigpen or any of these others, but anyone that kind of stands out that maybe we should give a little bit more attention to, the side characters. But we talked about Linus and Lucy and Sally's love for Linus, and then there's like the little ones. There's like Rerun, which was like kind of, I always confused him sometimes. I'm like, because he looks just like his bigger brother, Linus, but he's the little kid.
Yeah, and that was again a funny bit or gag with him always on the back of the bicycle.
Yes.
I think we didn't talk as much about Schroeder, but related to Schroeder, of course, is
music. Always focused on that music.
Yeah, and again, that's an artist type of thing, and he loved Beethoven and whatever. And as he relates to Lucy, of course, who had a crush on him, that shows again the complexity of Lucy. Right,
Yeah.
It's like she's crabby, right? She's like this crabby bully type person, but she had like this soft side like anybody else, I'm trying to think.
Yell at him too.
Oh, yeah, exactly. We have missed one important side character, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. Woodstock.
Of course.
we could do something on Snoopy and Woodstock,
his little bird friend, and really, he's Snoopy's sidekick. He's been there all the time, and a lot of great jokes. And here's a person who, the bubbles, you don't even get words, you just get the little scratch marks.
Exactly. When they had this like complex relationship, but again, what purpose does Woodstock serve? It gives Snoopy his own like little world, like away from the human characters. Like he has like a little bird friend who's his buddy, right? And yeah, Woodstock was a great, I guess, a great addition to the Peanuts gang. It's interesting how that started as more realistically drawn birds that were at first just sort of following Snoopy around, and then they developed like more of the look of the rest of the comic. But I think, and I don't know this for sure, but again, originally if you look at like the camping ones where they would go in camping, like there was Olivier, I think was one of the, but like I think that was before Woodstock, and then eventually he made the character of Woodstock, I think probably in the early 70s is when, well, it had with the name Woodstock, it had to have been post Woodstock.
Right.
Yeah, well, that would have been a pretty big coincidence.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's great. And again, a lot of these, you could do a whole episode on Linus or Lucy or, a lot of these.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to go back to the space thing, because the one time, I'm sure he did other ones, but even Charlie Brown had done these like kind of fantasy characters. So he did the Spaceman. There was a bunch of series in the comic strips where he'd just take a fishbowl, put it on his head, and walk around with a fishbowl. Like it would look like a space helmet. Like he'd be the great spaceman, right? But again, a lot of those fantasy then stuff went over to Snoopy when he would do these characters.
Yeah.
But I just specifically remembering the compilations and reading that whole series where he would just walk down the street with a fishbowl on his head. He's like, I'm a spaceman.
I don't remember that one, but we did. We had those compilation books too as kids.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of them, and they were great. We used to, me and my sister would, of course, we read them, but we would try to draw the.
Yeah.
We would sit down with a piece of paper and draw them, and we'd pick a story, like, because they were, like you said, they were compilations of stories, and maybe there were like 5 or 6 strips within the story, and we would draw them.
Yeah.
You know, I think I learned to draw from Charles Schulz.
I think a lot of people did.
That's what we copied. And if I look at, like, if I doodle something, it really is in that kind of cartooning style. You know,
and so
like
many cartoonists, when Charles Schulz passed away, they did these homages in their strips.
Yeah.
They included those characters, but you could also see how different they were. It's a very simplistic form of drawing, but it really was Charles Schulz who gave that. So anybody who wants to look up, Fantagraphics has a whole series of like a 20-something volume complete Peanuts collection, which gathers every single strip. Oh, you have one there. Which one is that? Number 1?
I had bought, when they first came out, the hardcovers. I bought the first 3.
There's
so
26 or 27.
Yeah, one day, then I think I had kids, and it was just like the funds went elsewhere. But I have up to 1952, so I have the first 3 of them.
I have the Calvin and Hobbes ones, which are hardcover and huge and big.
Yeah.
This is something that's decades. So again, I'm not surprised that you need like 20-something volumes to compile all of them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you want to see more adventures of Charlie Brown and Snoopy, Apple TV Plus has the rights now to do them. So they've done a bunch of specials and series. So you should definitely check those out. They're fun. You know, you can still see they've done good things. You wonder if Charles Schulz was still around, what storytelling angle it would go. But you saw the later decade or two of his life, not too many. I think that's because he was, I think just doing the strip itself probably drained him or took a lot out of him. He really didn't have time to delve. But those 60s and 70s and maybe early 80s, that was the golden age for those animated specials and movies.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I will say that I did enjoy the Peanuts movie.
The new one.
It's not, it's not on the level, of course, of the old stuff, but I thought they did a good job with them. I'm sort of disappointed it didn't go any further, because they seem to have, they had to sort of create in that, like, their own world, because you can't just recreate, like, what Charles Schulz did. So I thought, even though they had, I guess, I forget what they did, but they had taken some liberties, but I was okay with what they did.
Right.
And I thought there'd be more. I'm not sure, like, what happened there. They may have made a second one that wasn't as good. I don't even remember.
I haven't seen it. Everything I saw has been on Apple TV Plus.
Yeah. But the Peanuts movie, I think, is pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that does it. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you like, share, comment, and tune in again. Thank you, Vin, for joining me. We will be, you can catch us on Paranormal Popcast, but tune in again for the greatest characters in pop culture history. And I really appreciate everyone. Thank you.
And thank you for having me, Nick.